Hello and welcome to the Stephen and Peter Sachs Museum at the Missouri Botanical Garden. I'm Neshka Pfeiffer, Sachs Museum Curator, and your host and moderator for the Grafting the Grape online program series, which is sponsored in partnership with the Missouri Humanities Council and with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Today's presentation, Missouri Vines and Wines Then and Now by Michael J. Leonardelli, will begin shortly. This is the first presentation in the Grafting the Grape series, and we're very excited to have you join us. There are 6 presentations in this series, and they highlight content from the upcoming exhibition at the Sachs Museum called Grafting the Grape, American Grapevine Rootstock in Missouri and the World, which we hope will be open to the public later this summer. We're able to offer accessibility features, including ASL interpretation for the deaf and hard of hearing, and live captioning, which you can access via the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. To turn off, or for more options, click on that closed caption feature. A note about today's webinar: it will run approximately 1 hour. The presentation will be approximately 45 minutes, and we'll have time at the end for a Q&A session. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll sort through your questions and get to as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. Today's program will be recorded and posted on the Missouri Botanical Garden's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And I'm joining you from the Sachs Museum at the Garden, which I'd like to acknowledge is on the ancestral and occupied land of the Chickasaw Nation, Illini Tribe, Iowa Tribe, Kickapoo Tribe, Osage Nation, Oto-Missouri Tribe, and the Quapaw Nation. We acknowledge the ongoing relationships these nations have with this land and urge non-Native people to educate themselves about this history and about the contemporary work of tribal sovereignty within these nations. Through this acknowledgement, we honor the elders and their descendants of these indigenous nations in order to bring visibility to these long silenced histories while working toward a more just and equitable future. Our speaker today, Michael J. Leonardelli, will be presenting to us on the American wine industry east of the Rocky Mountains, and with a focus on American grapevines and the history of winemaking in Missouri. After a first career in healthcare finance, Michael earned an MS in food science from the North Carolina State University, and in 2010, he took a position with Missouri Extension to address quality assurance issues with new Missouri wineries and to serve as faculty for the new Viticulture and Enology courses offered at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Through 2016, he served as food science adjunct faculty, focusing on wine consumer education. Now retired, he resides in St. Louis and continues his commitment to educating wine consumers through online webinars and research. Welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for presenting to us today.
My pleasure, absolutely. So take it away. All right, the topic then is Missouri Vines and Wines Then and Now. What I'd like to do is give you a little preview or a roadmap of the topics we will cover today. We're going to look, of course, at history, including a concept or a function known as grafting, because that's very important in this industry. We're also going to examine Native American species and hybrids. Ultimately, we're going to answer the question, why are Missouri wines different? Why do they taste different? Why are their flavors different from European and West Coast wines? And you'll learn that it has something to do with the climate and the fact that we grow different grapes here. We're also going to take a brief look at some states' wine industries. These states are east of the Rockies, as we say, and then conclude with the Missouri wine industry as it exists today. Okay, first, a brief history of wine in general. It was an important aspect of Greek and then Roman civilization. The fermentation happened, they found it, they liked it, and so it became a part of their culture. Generally, a wine is considered to be of Persian origin, but it was pretty much wiped out in the Middle East by the rise of Islam. The appreciation of wine and the enjoyment of wine, though, was maintained during the Middle Ages by the church in Europe. Eventually, international trade grew and the middle class rose, and that led to extensive growth within the various wine industries. And of course, colonial settlers brought wine to the Western Hemisphere. Wine as we know it, that is. Okay, focusing on the history of wine in Missouri, German settlers settled around Hermann in the 1830s. This is on the banks of the Missouri River. It reminded them of their Rhineland home. There, they attempted to grow a lot of crops, but rocky soil was dominant. And it's true, rocky soil is, while unsuitable for most crops, is just right for grapevines. The truth of the matter is that grapevines don't like their feet to be wet. They do not want to have waterlogged roots. And so this turns out to be just ideal. Rocky soil would have excellent drainage. They also discovered that European grapes, though, did not survive the cold winters that they encountered here. But they also observed that Native American species did very well. By the 1850s, there were nearly 60 wineries in the Herman area that produced an estimated greater than 10,000 gallons per year. Apparently, Vienna had a World's Fair in 1851, and I found this very interesting because I was not aware of this until recently. Missouri took 8 of 12 wine gold medals. Well, that's impressive. By 1869, Missouri produced half of the wine that was produced within the United States as it existed at that time. And eventually, Italian immigrants came to add to the German wine heritage. They settled around St. James, Missouri. So by 1900, the Missouri wine industry was thriving. And in fact, Stonehill Winery in Herman was the second largest in the United States. By 1920, there were actually more than 100 wineries here. However, then came Prohibition. And for that period, 1920 to 1933, there was no commercial wine production. In fact, it was required that the vineyards be destroyed and the wineries themselves converted to other businesses. Some of the wine cellars, in fact, housed mushrooms because that was a perfect cool climate for them. It was only St. Stanislaus Novitiate in Florissant, actually, run by the Jesuits, where wine was permitted to be made for sacramental reasons. Some 20 years later, there was a rebirth post-Prohibition of the Missouri wine industry at Stonehill Winery, the same winery that had been the second largest in the U.S. around the turn of that century. Let me just interject a personal anecdote. It was about this time, I remember in the 1970s, reading about this new wine industry, and there was a lot of talk about Augusta. And I realized Augusta was not that far away. We lived in St. Louis. And so we took a little day trip out there and loved it immediately. But all of this came together. It was on a Saturday afternoon, I want to say in May of 1982. My wife and I and a couple with whom we're very close friends and have remained so, went to a Montel winery in Augusta. It was a beautiful sunny May day. We purchased a wine, or several, I believe, but one of them was Rose Gold. And we were enjoying it on one of their hillsides, green, overlooking the Missouri River. That's where it came together for me. I realized that wine in and of itself should be enjoyable as a beverage, but it's also the gestalt, where you are, who you're with. That's what really makes the wine experience such a wonderful one. But basic is that the wine be good to start with. Okay, so this was about the same time that a new tax was levied on all wine sales in Missouri. The key there is really the word all. Other states have done this, North Carolina being one of them where I did a lot of my studies. And North Carolina unwisely only taxed the wines that were produced in the state. Missouri taxed all wines sold. Good. Okay, this in turn funded the grape and wine program, as it was simply called at that point. And at this time, a viticulturalist was hired to assist in what they call the restoration process, meaning restoration after Prohibition. And at the same time, Augusta became the first federal AVA, or American Viticultural area. We're going to expand on that notion in a little bit. In 2003, Missouri was one of the few states to actually adopt or designate a state grape, and this was Norton, or as it's sometimes called below the southern border, Cynthiana. But Norton and Cynthiana are one and the same. Missouri refers to this grape as Norton. Now I want to talk a little bit about the French-Missouri connection. The setup for this was French vintners or winemakers imported U.S. vines. Remember these, the resulting wines had done very well at the Vienna State Fair a little bit earlier. Unfortunately, they imported the root louse, phylloxera, with the vines. Phylloxera are highly destructive of some vines that are not, if you will, haven't developed a resistance to them as the Native American vines had done. So this was devastating to the European wine industry, especially the French. By 1880, most of the vineyards had been destroyed. Well, meanwhile, back in the States, C.V. Riley, who was the first state entomologist, discovered that Native American grapes were resistant to the pest. Again, this kind of makes sense. They were thriving here. They had evolved over time and so could withstand the daily or periodic pests that showed themselves. At the same time, George Huseman, who was a researcher at the University of Missouri, and Herman Yeager, who was a breeder a grape breeder that is based in Neosho, developed the technique of grafting European vines onto Missouri native rootstock. The Missouri rootstock was phylloxera resistant. And subsequently, France imported, it's estimated, up to 10 million rootstock vines. The point of this is it did save the French wine industry. The French were so thankful for this that eventually they did place a sculpture at the, it's called the French School of National Excellent Agronomics. The fine print there states that this particular sculpture is a young woman cradling an older woman. It's located in Montpellier, France. And so it was the New World, the young country, the United States, helped the old world, or France, resolve this problem. So I mentioned grafting. Here's a visual. The rootstock is the lower part, so it's the roots, and the ground level is about here. So the roots extend into the ground, of course. Above ground, then, there is a joint which is developed, into which is placed the part of the vine called the scion. And in this case, it was the top of the vine, that which was growing, that of the preferred grapes in the French vineyards. They're all Vitis Vinifera. So the idea was that this combination would produce the desirable grapes, but again, would do so with a phylloxera-resistant manner of root. The two parts were joined in the graft union, which looks something like this. Okay, so that's essentially what grapevine grafting is about. By the late 1970s, grafting was determined to be unnecessary for survival, but it was a widely respected technique. So they moved from survival, the researchers, to improvement, such as with issues such as nematode resistance. Nematodes are worms, which also can have a very destructive effect upon the grapes. They may not kill the vines, but they certainly harm the resulting fruit of the vine. Other diseases that emerge, adapting to soils that are not quite right for the vines. And some can even influence the vine size if you have a situation where the nutrients are not widely available, and also on the crop level or quantity and the quality. So there's a lot of research going on within the use of and development of new rootstock. Okay, moving onward to grapevine taxonomy. Taxonomy is an ordered system of terms which are designed to illustrate connections, especially useful with natural phenomena, because the categories identify how one particular aspect is related to another. So example here, looking at just the first category, kingdom, is basically plants or animals. Grapevines, of course, are plants. We're going to skip the next few until we get to the family. The family is Viticultural. The genus, we often talk about genus and species. The genus is known as Vitis. An example of a species would be Vitis, the V stands for Vitis estivalis. And after that would come the strain or the variety of grape or the wine grape cultivar. An example of this would be Norton. Okay, so Viticultural, Vitis, species estivalis, grape Norton. So, what do all these Viticultural have in common? If they're a member of this family, they're all climbers. They require support, and that's why you will see vines on trellises in vineyards. The various wires support the grapevines. Another characteristic is the leaves on the vines alternate with tendrils or flowers. Tendrils are the little the parts of the vine which wrap themselves around whatever the support happens to be. In the woods, of course, it would be a tree. In a vineyard, it would be the trellises. The flowers themselves are the parts of the vine that become the grape clusters. They're also characterized by swollen or jointed nodes. So a little bit more on this genus Vitis. The estimation is that there are 50 to 60 different species of Vitis worldwide. Okay, so that's would come here. There are 60 of these, but greater than 8,000 varieties. So that's a significantly different number. And new varieties are still being discovered. In fact, researchers love to walk in the woods, if you will, and look for vines, and they can genomically test them to see if they've been identified or not. But another little factoid here is more than 90% of world wine production currently is based upon one genus and species, Vitis Vinifera, which we will keep discussing throughout this presentation. So to complicate this a bit, the Vitis has two subgenera, two genuses within the genus. The larger one is simply called Vitis, and what these have in common is they're all bunch grapes, the traditional grape cluster. There's another subgenera called Muscadinia, which is very small, only has 2 or 3 species. It's found in the southeastern part of the United States. Okay, to expand on this, so under Vitis, we have our species, varieties, and then cultivars. Vinifera would be the species. Cultivars of the Vitis vinifera would be examples, Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon. Another category of the species, although not officially recognized taxonomically, would be the Native American grapes, those which grew and adapted to their locations here in North America. Another group or category would be the hybrid grapes, and example of this would be vignoles. So when we look at the Missouri wine industry, we're frequently distinguishing between Native American and hybrids, and we'll occasionally reference vinifera, which are not widely grown in the state. Regarding Muscadinia, the other subgenera, rotundifolia is a species. Examples are muscadine and scuppernong. I wanted to include a picture here. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of sampling these. I did because I lived in North Carolina for some 20 years. These grow well along the coast. They're large berries, typically either bronze or this dark red. Personally, I think it's an acquired taste, but they do make excellent jams too, and some people love the wine. Okay, let's now take a look at the major Native American species that were used to develop these important rootstocks. There are several of these that are highlighted in the exhibit, but there's 3 in particular which are frequently used, are the primary ones. Vitis Riparian For instance, it prefers cool and fertile and deep soils, well supplied with water. Does not do well in drought-prone soils. Vitis rupestris roots deeply, has a long growing season, and it has very vigorous growth. In other words, there's a lot of leaves on it. And it tends to do better and is selected for warmer growing seasons, warmer and longer growing seasons. Then there's Vitis berlandieri. This one evolved in highly alkaline soils, which one encounters. These have a high salt content and are ideally used when the soil is of an alkaline nature. Some examples of rootstocks that have been developed recently. The point of this slide is simply notice these crosses are all variations of the three that we just mentioned here. Okay? And as an example, only this first one, 3309C, cross of Riparia and Rupestris. It's the standard for cool climates, widely used there, in contrast to something like 5BB, which is the cross of Vitis berlandieri and Vitis Riparia. And this is used for varieties which have a naturally low vigor. In other words, they don't grow readily on their own, so you give them a better rootstock, and that improves the nutrient flow and likely the water flow also. Okay, let's see how we do in here. Okay, good. Okay, I want to distinguish now between the crosses, hybrids, and clones. Definitions. A cross occurs when two varieties from the same species cross to form a new variety. So a lot of these crosses have occurred naturally. Hybrids occur when two different species of vine are crossed. And again, this can either be intentionally or naturally. So those are similar functions, but contrast that with cloning, which you have no doubt heard of. It is completely different. A clone is defined as an intentional, if you will, vegetative propagation of a single parent plant. Why would you do that? Well, you want to amplify the positive attributes of that particular grape variety. Okay? So there is a difference, crosses, hybrids, and clones. Now, the chart here is designed to just illustrate something that you'll be encountering at the exhibit. The column on the left is species. I believe there's 13 here. They're used for either rootstock, in developing hybrids, or in making wine. There's always got to be some others, such as breeding research or making jams. But look at the totals here. So 6 of them are used primarily for rootstocks, 8 in producing hybrids. Only 3, though, are used directly in making wine. Again, if you attend the exhibit, you're going to learn a lot about these species. Some famous Native American species are cultivars. Vitis labrusca, that has contributed Concord, which is a red grape, and Niagara, which is kind of its white counterpart. There have also been some hybrids, and this was developed naturally. Perhaps you've heard of Catawba. It's a cross or a hybrid of Labrusca and Vinifera, coincidentally. And I believe it was, if you will, discovered in the early, 1800s in North Carolina. And then Vitis estivalis as naturally crossed, so it would be the same genus and species with itself, and that's developed the current rendering of the Norton grape. So, what do these Native American species have in common? Well, they're cold hardy, so they do well with the winters. Of course, they've survived, evolved here. They have higher disease resistance, that is, to the diseases that are present and prevalent here, and are considered to produce good to very good quality product, whatever it is, wine, other foodstuffs. Now, all that said, there was something that occurred in the late 19th century that we refer to as French-American hybrids. So they are hybrids. This was in response to the phylloxera epidemic. So the phylloxera were tamed, the issue was resolved with the grafting techniques. There was also an attempt to hybridize that really did work very well. The idea there was to do this hybridization of an Native American species that was resistant to the disease and a Vitis Vinifera, or European grape type, that would, of course, possess positive European grape characteristics, grape and wine characteristics, good flavors. The only qualifier to this was that no Vitis labrusca were allowed into this development of French-American hybrids, because that was the genus and species that was considered to have foxy aromas. What does that mean? A kind of a wildness, a forwardness, not subtle. And the researchers and powers that be knew that this would not do well in Europe at that time. Now, in terms of hybrid breeding or development, there's really 3 stages, as applied during this French-American hybrid development. The first stage used crosses of American cultivars with Vitis Vinifera cultivars. That was the point. The second stage, though, took the hybrids that had occurred in the first stage and hybridized them with themselves. So there was no going back to the original Vitis Vinifera. And the third stage, usually, these are the more recent ones, use hybrids in the second stage and do cross them with Vitis Vinifera. The point there is to gain superior wine quality, which is the type of hybridization that's occurring today. So what are the advantages of these hybrids? Well, just like Native American plants, they are cold hardy. They have a later bud break. What does that mean? Well, that refers to when the buds come forth, when you can see them on the vines in spring. And later bud break is good because it's possible to encounter a spring freeze experience. We're going to develop that in a short time too. If, however, there is such an occurrence, there are fruitful secondary buds. In other words, the primary buds may be killed off with that freeze, but the secondaries will kick in. They may not produce as many grapes, but whatever they do, they tend to be of excellent quality. Hybrids are also disease resistant and make good wines or hybrids or jams or whatever they're intended to do. The basic disadvantages of hybrids is name recognition. These things are being developed, they're being put on the market, and they don't have any history at that point. And as I said, 90% of wine is produced from vinifera. These are not vinifera, so there will be a difference. So we talked about 3 stages. These French-American hybrids in stages 1 or 2 developed, well, these are just examples. Chambourcin, if you've visited the Missouri wineries, you've likely encountered this. It's a red grape. It makes excellent fruity, medium-bodied wines and is sometimes used for blending. Marichal Foch is also a red grape. It used to be more widely used in Missouri early on in the 70s and 80s, but I don't see much of it now. Seyval Blanc is a white grape. It tends to make wonderfully subtle and acidic wines. When chilled, they're excellent for a summer day. Vital Blanc is a white grape Blanc, but it's also it makes wines that are a little more robust. And in fact, it's really found a niche for itself in southern Ontario, the section between Niagara Falls and Toronto, where they make superb ice wines. American hybrids, based on the Native American grapes, you can find these more familiar names, that these occurred by chance, naturally in the woods. Examples of Le Noir, Catalba, which I mentioned earlier, are the Delaware grape, and of course by design, which is what the hybridizers are doing today. Recent American hybrid releases are the following. Let me just examine a few of these. Cayuga White came out in 1972. It was designed primarily for New York State. They use it extensively. It's Riesling-like in character. Chardonnay, as you might suspect, Chardonnay is one of the parents here, and is widely used in the Missouri wine industry. It has a lot of the characteristics of Chardonnay, and it winters over. You know, it can withstand the harsh winters. Frontenac is a red grape that was developed for what we call northern latitude vineyards. Think Minnesota, for instance. So they have to be able to reach a desirable ripened level within a shorter growing season. Traminette, very popular in Missouri and in Indiana, is a hybrid with one of the parents is Gewürztraminer, which is a highly aromatic and spicy, I think is often the word used to describe it, and is often associated with the German and Alsatian wines. And then a newer one, Valvin Muscat, is also gaining a lot of press because of its muscat aspects, and it too is quite delightful in terms of spiciness. Okay, so I've kind of dodged this so far. What is the issue with Vitis Vinifera? If it's so popular, why aren't we growing it in Missouri? What's the deal here? Well, it is highly susceptible to diseases and pests. Example, phylloxera. Climatic challenges, especially overwintering. And the truth of the matter is, because they don't grow well, we also, for good reason, don't have a lot of experience with vinifera practices. In other words, if something does seem to go wrong, if Mother Nature is not smiling upon the vineyard, can you intervene? And if you have a problematic harvest, what can you do to improve the quality of the wine? This has to be learned over time. That said, here are some of the famous Vitis Vinifera. You probably have encountered many of these names. Okay, so let's move on now. We're going to talk about climate now, because climate has such a large impact upon the grapes that are grown and the quality of the grapes. First, three designations. There's a term called macroclimate, which refers to a very large landmass. It could be a continent, country, or state. The climate of Missouri is actually designated as continental. And this is in comparison to maritime. Maritime would have a large body of water close to it. Tropical would be located in the southern or lower latitudes. Continental, think about that. Most of our weather comes from the northwest, so the air passes over the North American continent before it gets to us, and therefore has these characteristics of cold winters, warm and humid summers. We have the extremes, right? But that's what macroclimate refers to, that large area. Major aspects of this that must be considered: important, the length and nature of the growing season. That means the time between the last 32-degree temperature in the spring and the first one in the fall. That determines the season, and it must be long enough to bring the grapes to a desired level of ripening. Water availability. Grapevines don't want wet roots, but they need water, absolutely. Winter mean temperature, how cold does it get? But very importantly, the fluctuations. If the temperatures fluctuate too much, so you have a reasonable average, but you have, moving from 5 degrees up to 65 in a relatively short time, that's problematic for the vines, because the vines will start coming out early and then get zapped by the cold temperatures. Frequency of spring frost, which can be devastating. The heat and the humidity of the summer, because they lead to fungal rots as the clusters are developing. And harvest weather. You want your harvest weather to be dry, sunny. But the last thing you want is a tropical system to come north, which it has done into Missouri, because frankly, the water the great water, the 4 or 5 inches coming out of the system, will dilute the quality of the grapes. The other two designations are mesoclimate and microclimate. A mesoclimate consists of conditions within 10 feet of the ground for a particular site. And microclimate is really micro. I mean, it's within a very small area, such as the grapevine canopy. Canopy referring to the leaves that are, at the top of the trellis as the vine is developing. And the principle here is for a specific vineyard location, these combined elements of macro, meso, and micro should be able to bring the grape berries to the desired degree of ripeness. Now let's look at the temperatures themselves. Cool versus moderate versus hot climates. Cool climates tend to result in lower sugar, higher acidic wines. So white varieties are going to be more common. White wines do well with higher acid level. In fact, without it, they feel downright flabby. Big surprise. Generally, moderate temperatures favor better wines. This is the Goldilocks zone. Warm days allow for desirable ripening, and cool nights reduce the fungal rot pressure, and they also don't produce unwanted organic acids, which can make the grapes just too acidic. Hot climates tend to result in higher sugar levels. Okay, the sun and the heat convert more of the acid to sugar in the grape as it's ready for harvest, and sugar is what's fermented into alcohol. And so you end up with wines that have 14 to 15% of alcohol. And that's pretty high. I mean, remember, port is 18%. And heat also increased the rate of ripening. And sometimes grapes just do better in terms of their flavor profile if they take the time to ripen. And as I've alluded to earlier, high humidity does create just a petri dish situation for some of these clusters. And the tragedy there is the cluster can look wonderful on the outside, and as the grapes are removed, you see that the interior is just rotting out because of the fungus within. Upshot, grape berries prefer warm, sunny days and cool nights for ripening. Okay, so when it comes to considering a particular area for a vineyard, three critical considerations are: what does the winter do? Are there a lot of spring frosts, and how hot and humid are the summers? Okay, here's a map which shows you the average annual minimum temperature. And Missouri, being in the middle of the country, has 4 zones represented, from 4 to 7. The warmest area is down here in the boot heel, so that's what it gets down to 0 to 10 degrees. The yellows are 0 to -10. The green would be -10 to -20. And these little blues, and there's a lot more blue in Iowa and Minnesota, of course, gets down to -20 to -30. So you have to be aware of that, factor that in. Now, a couple of real experiences that occurred: spring frosts. First, we're going to look at a tale of 2 Aprils. Then we're going to look at the devastating Easter freeze in 2007. The 2 Aprils. Well, the setup for these April situations were the previous month, March. Notice here in March of 12 that the jet stream is up here north, with the result that the temperatures were much above normal, or more warm. In fact, I think March 2012 in St. Louis was the warmest March on record since 1875, when records began. Contrast that with the next year, 13. Whoops, the jet stream's down here, and all of this is much below normal. Now, I took these photos, and they're just wonderful examples here to illustrate this point. April 12th, 2012, that morning there had been one of these spring frost events. That was the year that March had been very warm, and notice the vine was really coming out. There were leaves at this point, which was quite early. But notice too, these leaves don't look very happy after this frost. And in fact, everything that was coming out on the vine was in fact nipped, and the leaves fell, and they had to rely upon their secondary buds that year. Okay, actually a year and 1 week later in 2013, look at this vine. Okay, this was the year that, we had a very cool March. with the result that the vines were not coming out that rapidly. And in fact, when they had this particular freeze event, there was no damage because things were not far enough along to be damaged. So great deal of variety based upon the entire spring weather experience. Okay, the 2007 devastation, and this goes down in infamy, and it was widespread. But look what happened here. Again, with temperatures, the last 8 days or so of March, you're getting temperatures, highs and lows that look more like May, mid to late May. Departures above average are pretty much in the 20s. This lasted a little bit into April, but by April the 4th, look what happens. You have 5 days below freezing, and the averages are significantly below normal. In fact, it's bottomed out in the morning of the 7th with 19 degrees. There were a couple of problems here. First of all, everything was out because of March being warm. But secondly, this experience was not only severe and abruptly severe, but look, it lasted for 5 days. So this was the kind of thing that just destroyed entire vineyards. And it was widespread. I was in North Carolina at the time, and we were having the same issues in North Carolina that Missouri was experiencing. This doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it can be absolutely devastating. Okay, precipitation, yeah, right, it varies a lot in Missouri. Just a visual, the orange, these are the lesser amounts, and the blue is the greater amounts. But average Missouri precipitation can run from under 36 inches to this little purple spot here is above 50 inches. It's quite a variance, quite a range. Okay. 2012, not only was it hot, it was dry also. And while I was at Mizzou, we were called to investigate this particular vineyard that was located in southern Boone County. The reason for the call was the owner was wanted to remove these vines because look at them, they were dying, right? He thought, or that's what he thought they'd become victims of something called Pierce's disease, which is a bacterial infection which destroys vines. And yes, vines mid-season end up looking like this. You know, it's just not a good situation. We took one look at these and said, don't do that. You don't have a Pierce's disease problem. You have a drought problem. This was lack of water. Yeah, he had no irrigation, that's true. And compare this to this photo, which is, believe it or not, just next door. I mean, it's not that close, but it was, a vineyard away. They had irrigation, and their crops were looking like this at the same day and time. So, that to that. Irrigation or enough water is important. The problem is when somebody considers going into this industry, irrigation systems are expensive, and they sometimes make the unwise decision to not go that route. And once every 10 years, you're going to wish you had such a system. Okay, there are also other events, abiotic stressors, as we call them. Very hot summers, the flood of '93, hurricane season that brought us Katrina. Those continue to move inland, can create severe thunderstorms. Very cold winters at the end of the 70s, and my new word, derechos. Apparently, St. Louis experienced one. We were not here at the time. In July of '06, this was the occurrence where ahead of thunderstorms, ahead of a line of thunderstorms, there will be a gust front, as they call, with winds of 75 to 80 miles an hour. No rain, just this wind. Eventually the rain comes. And it lasts, for this 45 minutes, and the systems itself stay together for a long time. I believe St. Louis, the entire metropolitan area, was without power for quite a while. More recently, one occurred last August in Iowa and extended all the way into northwestern Ohio. If the vineyard's in that spot, it will be devastated. Okay, let's take a quick look at the American viticultural areas, AVAs. There are 4 of them in Missouri. Augusta, we mentioned, was the first one. only 15 square miles. The criteria for achieving AVA-hood is that there be a unique soil, a unique climate. So we're talking not about the macroclimate, but the meso and the micro, and the wines themselves reflect that uniqueness. As you will learn when you go to Augusta, Napa Valley was the second AVA, and they're proud of the fact that they got theirs in first. Augusta, small, it's on the north side of the Missouri River along Highway 94. Hermann AVA was recognized in '87. Again, the German settlers established the Hermann area. It's on the southern side of the Missouri River to the west in Gasconade and Franklin counties. The Ozark Mountain AVA was established in the mid-'80s. 3.5 million acres, pretty large, right? It is considered the 6th largest AVA in the United States. There it goes. So it's not only Missouri, but also it goes into Oklahoma and Arkansas. The Ozark Highlands AVA, which was the 4th one, consists of 11 counties in Missouri. And here, this picture puts it all together. So the green area is your Ozark Highlands. And here's the Missouri portion of the Ozark Mountain. And you look closely, here's Little Augusta and slightly larger Hermann. But these AVAs are in the southern half of the state. Okay, some Missouri wine facts. In 2011, there were 104 wineries. Today, 10 years later, there are 132. Now, there are a few large ones, a few moderate, but most of these 132 are small in terms of production. In fact, the large wineries, I don't have the absolute statistic, but it's something like 5 wineries produce 80% of the wine made in the state. So that's significant. They've been doing this, they're the older established ones, been doing this for a while, but that is the way it is. Number of acres in vineyards, it's kind of hard to quantify, but we know there's at least 1,600, if not more. And they grow mostly native and hybrid varieties. Vinifera do not do well here. And here's an illustration of the 132 wineries. You don't probably see it well, but here's the Missouri outline. North, here's St. Louis, Boot Heel, across the south, here's Kansas City. But they're fairly well distributed. If you go to a Missouri winery, what are you likely to find? These names, many of which we've talked about already today. In 2017, the Grape and Wine Board did do an economic impact study. And these are impressive numbers, right? 3.2 billion in revenue, 1 billion in annual wages, over 28,000 jobs, and nearly 900,000 wine-related tourists. And supporting the tourism is the series of Missouri wine trails. Put together. The wine trails are wineries that work together. They're usually in a fairly small area, or one that visitors can use to visit those wineries in a particular day trip, typically. Anyhow, we have 9 of them established at this point. My favorite one, this is when the light bulb went on, I was number 1 down here in South Central Missouri. Look at the word, which is French from Ove, I think, or River Ovas, that kind of thing. Arc. Okay, say that a couple of times real quickly, and that will evolve into Ozark. Okay. I want to do a little bit about again, the wine industries east of the Rockies. So here's a concentration. We're not talking about the West Coast. You can see, well, you probably know how much of the action occurs there. But notice there's these little dots throughout this area, east of the Rockies. I think it was in 2002 that the 50th state established its wine industry, and I believe that was North Dakota. Anyhow, we're going to look at a couple of the significant states. New York is certainly one of them. It's first in USA East Coast wine production, because the big 3, California, Washington State, and Oregon, are the numbers 1 through 3. And they grow grapes in certain areas. Lake Erie, which is this section along the lake, close to 60%. The Finger Lakes, which is a beautiful area, a lot of tourists, 30%. There's also some on Long Island, in the Hudson Valley north of New York, and even on the Niagara Escarpment. Concord is still the number one. They for both juice and wine. They grow a lot of hybrid varieties, such as those. But interestingly, they're also growing certain vinifera, such as Riesling, Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc, and Pinot Noir. These varieties are known to do better in the cooler climates. But remember, New York State does have a little closer access to some maritime, some large bodies of water. So the vinifera are going to be grown in the areas which will support that to a degree. Now, another state with an advanced wine industry is Virginia. In fact, they grow 70%, or 70% of the grapes they grow are vinifera, and the rest are hybrids or American. Again, remember, Virginia is further south, but that doesn't count as much as the proximity to the maritime Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean, which has a great effect upon its weather. There's North Carolina, just south of Virginia. Now, they can focus on, two different types of grapes. One of them are the muscadines we talked about earlier, which grow well in the southeastern part of the state. And in this section here, which is really the foothills of the mountains, this is the mountainous section. Whoops. This is the mountainous section. So these are the areas where they're growing a lot of vinifera. Again, they can do this because they're farther south, and the ocean has a huge moderating effect upon the climate. Michigan, 15,000 acres, do a lot of juice, 13% wine. But what impressed me with the first time I visited there was that they grow a lot of vinifera. And even more interesting is a lot of it's grown up here, very far northwestern Michigan. How is this possible, you might ask? Well, because what happens during the winter, this is Lake Michigan, you have those lake effect snows, okay? The warm, relatively cold air passes over the warm air of the lake. As soon as it gets over land, it dumps snow. Once it's established, it keeps snowing, and it keeps staying there for the rest of the winter season. Fact of the matter is, snow provides a great deal of insulation, and therefore vinifera can withstand the cold winters. Ohio too has quite an industry, and they're growing a little more vinifera certainly than we do, but again, they have Lake Erie up here. Indiana, very little vinifera. They grow Traminette and Norton. Yeah, okay. So just a selected few states to give you an idea. As we approach the end of this, economic challenges. I heard this when I started into this grape and wine business. The statement was, if you want to make a small fortune in the grape and wine industry, start with a large one. I laughed. But as I analyzed the financial aspects of this, I understood how much wisdom there was in that statement. The other part of it was, if you really want to be a success in this industry, you have to have instantly 20 years of experience. Hard to come by, right? You're dealing with Mother Nature, and you're always experimenting. Okay, with that as a background, therefore, to survive, you have to have good cash flow, which is usually a function of good business sense and planning. In visiting the wineries as I did see what I think is the success model. And it's essentially commitment for the long term. 3 generations are involved. Grandparents usually provide the capital. Mom or dad run the winery while the other one keeps the day job. Children get degrees. Another point to make here is there is a need for cash flow wines. And by that, I'm referring to sweet wines. A lot of people who visit these wineries love sweet wines. And this has led to probably an overproduction of sweet wines, overproduction in the sense that it can be alienating to serious wine drinkers. A lot of them also have developed venues for large group celebrations that provide some economic stability, but it can also be tempting to focus on that instead of the original grape and wine mission. Lastly, the Missouri Wine and Grape Board, it exists to support the industry. They're well funded by this tax I mentioned earlier, 12 cents per gallon, and they do both marketing and research. The research is based at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and for instance, a lot of it's focused on Norton, the state grape. Norton grows beautifully here, but it is a problematic grape for winemakers because it has very small berry size, a lot of tannins therefore, and is highly acidic. All right, in conclusion, what have we covered? We looked at the history of wine in general and Missouri wines. We looked at this grafting, which put us on the map with the French. We examined Native American species and hybrids. And ultimately, we addressed this question, which is implicit, if not right in front of us. Why are Missouri wines different? Why are they? Why do the flavors? Why are the aromas different? Why do they taste different? And the truth of the matter is because there are limitations of the climate, which cause us to grow different grapes. And we're still fairly young. We don't have all that experience we need. We also took a quick look at other states' wine industries and the present state of the Missouri wine industry. I was kind of interested to read, I think it was the headlines of the Sunday Post-Dispatch the other day about this developer who's purchased 4 out of 5 of the major Augusta wineries and plans to make this a destination rivaling Napa. Okay, we'll see. Finally, a quote, "Wine is constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy." Thank you, Ben Franklin. All right, Neshka.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was fabulous. Thank you. And what I also want to point out to our audience is that this incredible breadth of knowledge, Michael actually shared as a researcher for the exhibition that we're going to be opening later this summer. So the amount of information you've been able to share is amazing in such a short period of time. So thank you so much for doing that. And we do have a couple of questions. So I am going to start by asking, how is it that vinifera grapes seem to survive well in the Finger Lakes regions, but not Missouri?
Well, it's because of the the meso and the microclimates. One of the things that area has going for it, the Finger Lakes, is the slope, and you can have the mesoclimates that are going to be relatively hospitable. In other words, the cold air falls to the bottom, and if the vineyards are a little bit higher up, they will not incur the same cold weather. That has a lot to do with it. So remember, the macro, meso, and microclimates interact to allow things to develop. I hope that's clear.
Great, thank you. If the person who asked that question wants to follow up, they're certainly welcome to. And the next question is from Terry Hayter. Why do Missouri and Illinois produce primarily sweeter wines versus California wines? Or at least that's what they seem to see in the grocery store.
Well, I would have to agree with them. I tried to touch on that just a little bit. It's the cash flow wine. People like sweet wines, and the wineries rely upon this agritourism considerably, and so when people come there, they are seeking repeat customers, and so they don't want to turn anybody off by not having any wines that aren't desirable to them. So there's a implicit sales push to or demand, I should say, for the sweet wines. And a good sweet wine can be made by stopping fermentation when there's still sugar left in the wine. Unfortunately, a lot of these cash flow wines are made by simply adding sucrose, table sugar, to the wine, which is, from my perspective, kind of cheating, but it does achieve a sweet wine which is not meant to be aged. All right.
Right, exactly. And I actually have a question for you, Michael.
Good.
Where are the French-American hybrids most popular? Because I think that's part of the wine industry I'm least familiar with, and I'm kind of curious if there's a market for them overseas.
I believe some of them are grown, especially in France. You're likely to find some of them. They're more used in blends, I think. And also remember, the French wine industry, for the most part, is not about varietal wines. It's usually about designations. And so you can have one of these French American hybrids in certain wines if the regulations, the powers that be allow it. But it will likely be in a small amount. So yeah, they are used there. But in the United States, they're pretty widespread in all the east of the Rockies wineries.
Okay, that's great. And I think that, let's see, we've got one more question. Oh, we just to thank you for answering the previous question. Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe the last question that I'd like for you to end on is, because you've so well described the diversity of climates and microclimates and also the impact of large kind of catastrophic environmental events or weather events, what do you think are some of the things that people should be paying attention to in terms of the wine industry, both the one in Missouri and other parts of the United States?
Okay, are you talking about climate change in particular? Yeah,
it can be, yes. You can interpret it that way for sure, yeah.
Yeah, I would say, well, actually, that probably is the answer, because what we're experiencing right now are extremes in the weather. I mean, even this growing season has been unusual. We're heading for a very cool May, much cooler than, I mean, like I looked recently, it was 6 degrees below normal, and it's been very dry, at least here. The rain has been spotty. So, yeah, sometimes during these years of transition, probably a crystal ball is what the viticulturist needs more than anything else, because while the predictions are pretty good, there's still this weirdness that can happen. Oh, another example was the February cold snap, which lasted 2 weeks. It was something like the 10th longest cold snap that is temperatures under 32 degrees since, again, records began. That wasn't predicted until a couple days before it happened. So we're getting these kind of just extreme things. But everything seems to be heading toward drier, hotter, just the general thing.
Right.
And remember, England is now growing grapes, which they never could do before. And Canada will likely do much better in the future. So.
Right, and we actually in the exhibition, one of the collections from the garden is sharing some objects, include the William Brown Center, which is known for its biocultural collections. And we in fact have a bottle of wine from the Himalayas, from Tibet and Nepal, so they're actually able to grow there. And we did get one more question squeaked in, so I do want to ask you this. You addressed the German settlers and their wines, but not the French who arrived in the 1700s. Did they bring any vines with them?
Well, they brought their vinifera, which did not do well unless they happened to be near the coast, where they would have a fighting chance. And I suspect that's, unless if they were in the northern colonies, their vines would not have survived, but they would have become intrigued by the native vines. And if they were willing to sample the wines, and they were well-made wines, they could enjoy them, but they were different.
Exactly. Okay, great. So I want to thank you again, Michael, so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And I will just wrap up to thank you again. Thanks to all of our accessibility folks who've been helping us share this event today too. I'd like to promote the next talk, which will be taking place June 9th at 6 p.m. Central Time. And you can register for it in the link that I've just popped in the chat. It's called Grafting the Grape, the Archaeology of American Indigenous Peoples' Use of Grapes. And we're going to have Dr. Susan Kuhlman, who's a professor of anthropology at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville, who's going to be sharing her research, not only in these, pre-contact foodways, but also talking about how grapes would have been used back then. I also did pop a survey form in our chat box. We'd love to get some feedback from everyone who attended today. We'll be sharing this information, and it's anonymous, of course, with our funders, which includes the Missouri Humanities Council, which we thank very much for supporting this project. And we hope that when we'll get a chance to open the exhibition, people can come and see some of these actual species. You're actually looking at one of those specimens on that slide right now. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us, for everyone who's participated and who shared, and Michael for sharing your expertise and knowledge. And we look forward to seeing you all on June 9th if you are able to join us. Thank you.